Many turn of the century Irish writers staged their works in the England of their residence, rather than the Ireland of their birth. For example, all of Wilde's plays and most of Shaw's, the novels of Wilde, Shaw, and Bram Stoker, and all but one of Moore's pre-1900 fictions. Recent Irish critics have often read such works as somehow about the island they do not mention. Dracula by Bram Stoker has particularly been targeted for renationalization by means of allegorical readings. The tale requires no summary. Everyone has seen at least one of the 250 films it inspired. And once imagined, the figure of the bloodthirsty vampire stays in the memory. Original reviews, while condescending to its literary mechanisms, acknowledge the qualities that made Dracula an immediate bestseller, that the horrid details and thrilling plots of Maidens at Risk made it a successfully spine-tingling flesh creeper, like the best of Wilkie Collins or Sheridan's Le Fanu. In the last 10 years, scholars have seen not just Irish matters in it, but much more, nearly everything indeed. It is said to be about the threat to England of immigrant Germans, Jews, Gypsies, and syphilitics, about colonization, reverse colonization, and empire at risk, about questionable genders and sexualities, about urbanization, professionalization, bureaucratization, and technologies of communication. Among the Irish interpretations, Dracula is said to be the Parnell, wild or starving tenants, an upstart Catholic misogynist or ascendancy bloodsucker. A more likely candidate for renationalization cortisol allegory might be Esther Waters, George Moore's most successful book. The novel follows the fortunes of a servant in a large Sussex horse-racing household. She becomes pregnant by the footman, loses her job, and goes to London to have her baby, and then to support her son by her wages as a wet nurse. The success house in which the novel begins and ends is partly based on Moor Hall in Mayo. Some of the house servants are modeled on specific Moor Hall servants. Moore's empathy with the underclass and recognition of the moral dignity of each individual's struggle for survival is exemplary of an Irish landlord who declined to shore up landlordism. The whole point of his novel is that the masses were really individuals who had as much right to live as any other. But for all that, Esther Waters, like Dracula, was not meant to be a comment on the Irish situation or an expression of the Irishness of its author, nor was it taken to be by anyone at the time of publication. So when we come to the Irish modernist projects, artık ne tür projeler ortaya koyuyorlar modernistler, onlara da bir bakalım. The interrelationships between Victorian literature, literature by Irish people, or literature about Ireland, and international modernist literature during the period between 1880 and 1920 can be illuminated by a look at the specific publishers of this literature. A key London publisher of Irish interest books was Edmund Downie, a Waterford writer who began his editorial career with William Tinsley of Tinsley Brothers, which issued the novels of Mrs. Braddon and the travels of Sir Richard Burton. It had been Tinsley who, in 1883, brought out George Moore's A Modern Lover. In 1885, Downey and a partner set up their own firm, Ward and Downey. The firm made a special place for Irish writers, and its list included fanciful, verbose, and humorously Irish works like those. Bunlar uzun uzadıya var burada yazıyor. Onlara bir bakarsınız. Bunları da geçiyorum arkadaşlar. One can detect in the boil of publication by Irish people in London an inchoate Irish modernism coming to the surface. In the 1890s, two other young publishers established themselves and would become channels of new Irish writing to the wider English reading public. Hatta dikkat ederseniz yeni şirketler kuruluyor ve bunlar da roman konusunda İrlanda halkına daha büyük fayda sağlamaya çalışıyorlar. The first William Heinemann, ki bu devam ediyor bu Heinemann'lar biliyorsunuz. Baskı olarak söylemeye çalışıyorum. Had a particular sympathy for European literature and literature that aimed to achieve classic status. Heinemann published English translations of eserlerin adları var, yazarlar var, bunları geçiyorum. After the very positive critical reception given the Real Charlotte, Somerville and Rose changed from Edmund Downie's house to Heinemann, who brought out the big house of Inver in 1925, which indicates the author's transition in the market from Irish interest books to novels of quality. However, between those two novels, Somerville and Rose worked for Longmans, Green and Company, publishers, writing stories in the series that began with some experience of an Irish RM. These proved so successful. Some experiences sold particularly well in India from Longmans' Bombay printing house that Somerville and Rose remained for 30 years within the category of Irish humor. In the 1890s, Heinemann set out to add George Moore to his list, a natural fit with its European and high art features. Before he succeeded in this aim, he had to wait the termination of Moore's relationship with T. Fisher and Unwin. This publisher issued a number of series that included Irish authors. The Pseudonymous Library, the Children's Library, and the Cameo series all had titles by Yeats, for instance, and the New Irish Library published 5 books by Charles Gavan diye gidiyor. The principal modern authors in Unwin's list were Joseph Conrad, Pearl Craigie diye geçiyor, and Moore. While Unwin was a very commercial person with no self-sacrificing attachment to Ireland or great literature, he was happy to do business distributing books by Irish people, if the business was good. He profitably issued Yeats' poems and entered into a distribution deal with Seeley, Bryars and Walker, a Dublin publisher for Samhain, an occasional magazine relating to the new Irish theatre. These co-publication arrangements became significant when the revival shifted its base from London to Dublin at the turn of the century. Inspired by his friends, Yeats and Edward Maitland, Moore moved to Dublin in 1901 to lend his talent and force of personality to the cultural revival. One of his first projects was to write short stories and to have them translated into the Irish language, so that they might serve as models of modern prose literature for young Irish-speaking authors. Short storyler de başlıyor bakın İrlanda'da. Thus, the Untitled Field was deliberately conceived as a school book for short story writers. Moore had already published a considerable number of stories in British magazines since the early 1880s, and some of those stories he wrote with Irish settings. Stylistically, they are excellent examples of the naturalistic method of Guy de Maupassant, as modified for English tastes and subjects, and later modified once more for Irish tastes and subjects. New stories were drafted based on what Moore saw and heard upon his return to Ireland after years away, and these he self-consciously conceived in the manner of Turgenev, a gentlemanly, poignant, philosophical view of provincial life. The collection as a whole was united by the question, is it possible to regenerate a degenerate Ireland? One title Moore considered was Ruin and Weed. 6 of these stories were translated by Patrick O'Sullivan and published in 1902. diye isim geçiyor. There is no sign that any Irish-speaking young author began to write stories in any of the narrative styles displayed in the volume. But 21-year-old James Joyce began in the same year a remarkably similar project of thematically linked short stories Dubliners, not published until 1914. Neither Moore nor Joyce was primarily concerned with writing books for Irish speakers or for Irish people of any language. They had wider ambitions. In April 1903, The Untitled Field was co-published by Unwin in London and by Bell's Indian and Colonial Library throughout the British Empire. An American edition came out from Lippincott in the same year. A European edition was distributed in bookstores across the continent by Tachnitz also in 1903. The Untitled Field and Dubliners are representative cases of the intersection between the Irish revival and modernism. Both are closely with the Irish scene and matters of interest to Irish people at the time. Anti-clericalism is a dominant note in each, but they are written in cutting-edge, realist prose styles and ultimately published for readers of masterly writing throughout the world. Moore planned a climax of anti-clericalism for the Untitled Field, a final story about a priest who, by thinking long and hard about why he had denounced an attractive pregnant single woman in his parish, decides to give up the priesthood and secretly disappear from Ireland. Declericalization, in other words, was the wished-for remedy for an Ireland weighed down by a wealthy and oppressive church, as it had once been weighed down by an ascendancy. The appropriate narrative method for such a late seemed to Moore to be a version of the monologue interior invented by his French bon ami, Edward Duyardin. Moore sank himself lyrically into the mental associations that arose in the mind of Father Gauquarty in walks along the banks of Lough Carra. The priest gradually comes to realize that he is being dishonest with himself and impious as well, for one must love life, not curse it. The capstone short story grew into a novel, published in 1905 by William Heinemann. It was an entirely new form of fiction in English, the stream of consciousness, yeni çıkıyor bakın o dönemde de, a technique that Joyce would carry much farther in Ulysses.